Hey, welcome back to Lick of the Week videos. I thought I would start a series on theory and its application to the banjo. And you know, theory is one of those things we talk about a lot on forums like the Banjo Hangout, and theory can be explained as just a system of rules and guidelines that help you understand how notes and sounds fit together. And it's a way to try to explain with words and terminology, you know, things that we hear that we're trying to play on an instrument. So for me personally as a player, if you cannot apply the theory that you learn to the instrument and to the songs and the music you're playing, then it's really not going to do much good other than just being something really interesting to discuss and talk about. But since most of us here on the Hangout are musicians or want to be musicians, we need to understand what it is we're playing. So what I want to focus on is using theory, which applies to all instruments that can play these notes, not just banjo. But we're going to look at theory, classical theory, some of the terminology and some of the explanations for the sounds that we hear and apply it to the banjo. And again, this is going to be kind of universal information. And you know, I'm a three-finger player, but you can apply these same rules to old-time jazz, any kind of style of banjo playing that you want to play, because the rules are all the same for all the instruments. We're just going to look at it in terms of the banjo. Now, to start any serious discussion about theory, we need to use building block ideas or foundational ideas of theory. And the most foundational thing in all music is the notes themselves, because if you don't understand the notes, or you can't hear how the notes fit together, then you can't play music. Really, you can't make anything that sounds like good music. So let's start with the building block notes. Now, in our kind of music, which is Western civilization, you know, not music like music based in India and the Middle East, which has a different set of scale notes. We're going to deal with the scales and the notes that we use in our kind of music, which would be the 12 notes. And so I'll list them out here in text, and then we'll play them on the banjo, and I'll show you, you know, basically how we can find these notes on the fingerboard. And again, this is not something that is going to make an immediate impact on your playing, especially if you're a beginner or somebody who just dabbles in theory. This is a lifelong process of figuring out not only where these notes are, but how to use them in music, which is much more important. But so take this series of videos as they're intended as a supplement to your ear and to hearing and understanding how sounds work together, which is much more important than just memorizing notes. But so let's get started. The notes in order will be called this at the bottom, and we'll start with the letter A sharp / B flat. We'll explain that in a second. C sharp / D flat, D sharp / E flat, F sharp / G flat, then G sharp / A flat, and then we'll return again to A. So there are basically 12 notes that we have to worry about: A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Then A starts the series, same 12 notes again, an octave higher. And then we have those notes in between, the sharps and the flats. So the first thing we need to do, you know, if you're interested in seeing how these 12 notes apply to the banjo, then your obvious question would be, okay, once I've memorized those 12 notes, how do I find them on my banjo? And what use are they going to be for playing music? Well, the easy part will be finding the notes. The much more complicated part, and something that's going to take many years of training, is to understand exactly how all these notes on the fingerboard relate to the music you play. But we have to start somewhere, so let's just start with the notes themselves. We know if we're tuned in standard G tuning, which I am, that we have certain notes. Fifth string is G, fourth string is D, then we have the third string is tuned to G, B, and another D. So we have some starting notes. Now the thing to take notice of when we're talking about what I call the grand set of notes, or those 12 building block tones of music, is they don't change, and they're always in that same order, and they're always the same distance apart. So you can't really rearrange the notes and say A, B, F if you're going from one note to the next. They're all in what we call half steps apart. So one of the basic ways that we can look to see what the distance is between notes of those 12 that we're talking about is to say that notes are either a half step or a whole step apart. Now this relates pretty well to a fretted instrument like the banjo, because every fret position on your banjo, if you go from one fret to the next, is the same as a half step, or the same as going from one note to the next note directly without skipping any notes. So if we wanted to go one note at a time on each string, say the 4th string, every time we move up one fret on the banjo, we're moving what we say in music terms chromatically, which means a half step at a time, to the next note directly after it. We're not skipping over any notes out of the 12. They're always in the same order. If we move from one note to the next, we're said to be moving chromatically, or one note at a time, through all 12 notes. So it's not too hard, but we need to have a starting place. So for the sake of the banjo here in G tuning, which most people, that play bluegrass and old-time music, they'll tend to play G tuning as one of the first tunings they learn. There's a lot of different ways to tune the banjo, obviously, and even in bluegrass, and especially in old-time, they use alternate tunings. All you really need to know to find every note on every string is the starting note. So we have our starting notes: D, G, B, D, and another G. And you notice we have 2 D strings and 2 G strings. And the only difference is those notes are an octave apart, or a whole set of 12 notes apart. And that's something we'll explore in the videos. But let's look at the D string. And since we know each note goes from one note to the next, and each note is a half step apart, and we know each fret on the banjo, if you go from one to the next fret, is a half step, it should be pretty easy to name the notes. Now, one of the things you noticed when we talked about all the notes was that some of the in-between notes, like D, D sharp, and I said /E flat, some of the notes have 2 names, and that tends to be kind of a source of confusion for a lot of people when they're trying to understand what the notes are and how they work. The fancy theory term for this is inharmonic equivalence, which is a fancy term for 2 notes that basically sound the same but have 2 different names. And what happens in an easy to say layman's terms is that notes, if you're going up in pitch, if the notes are going up in pitch, we can tend to say that the notes in between the major notes, like D, D sharp, we'll call the notes going up in pitch sharps. But if we were to reverse the notes and start going lower in pitch each time, we're still hitting the same major notes, but the notes in between, instead of being called sharps, would be called flats. So let me show you an example of this. I'll go from the open 4th string to the 5th fret, and we'll name each note. Remember, each note is going to be a half step apart. So we know the first note is D. D. The first fret would be D sharp. E would be the next note. After E is F. There's nothing in between E and F. F sharp and G. Now let's reverse the notes. Stay on the 4th string. We'll start at the 5th fret, and we'll just reverse the notes. G. But instead of calling this F sharp like we did a second ago, we're going to call this G flat, because we're going lower in pitch. F. E. Now this would be E flat, D. So D sharp and E flat are the same note. F sharp and G flat are the same note. It just depends on which direction you're going, sharps or flats. And it also relates to the key that you're playing in, which is something we'll talk about later in a future video. But for now, we'll stop with this, and I'm actually going to send in 2 videos this week. We'll pick up with video number 2. See you then. Thanks.